Do you have a 2.0 Subaru with oil in your coolant, a blown head gasket, or both? Well, if you do, stay tuned because I'm going to show you how to take care of it. I also have a treat for you because I have some big bloopers in this video. Stay tuned. Hey, thanks for checking out Nuts and Bolts with Tone and welcome to my channel. Today I have a 2.0 Subaru non-turbo that has a blown head gasket. We've got oil in the coolant, and I'm going to show you how to replace these head gaskets, do the timing, and reseal it. We're also going to take care of the upper oil pan, which is also another common cause of oil in the coolant. Let's get going. So the first step in doing this job for me was removing the intake manifold. I pulled the intake off, I pulled the alternator off, and the alternator came off because it was easier to pull the engine with the intake and the alternator off. So pull those two off, pull the engine out, put it on an engine stand, and let's get to tearing it down.
So the first thing we need to do is remove the accessories, the AC compressor, the pulley assembly over here on the side, and the idler on the front. Just get those out of the way. So we're going to completely remove the wiring harness from the engine. Now be really careful not to disturb or damage the clips that hold the harness in its little brackets. Now these pliers are from Lyle. They are the electrical disconnect pliers. What they do is they grab on one side of the connector and then they depress the tab to help disconnecting connectors so much easier. So then just work one side to the other and then get the harness all disconnected and lift it up and away it goes. So before I take off the timing cover, I'm going to take off the water pump. And I always leave a bolt or two in a water pump, and then I tap it with a hammer so it breaks loose and the coolant drops. That way I don't take a coolant bath. Next up, go ahead and take your thermostat off. I always leave the lower hose connected to the thermostat housing because there's no reason to disconnect it. You definitely want to take that off and pop that thermostat out. Because if you have oil in your coolant, then the seal swells, or if you have a blown head gasket, the thermostat is definitely something you want to take care of. So next up is the timing cover. Now the timing cover has a lot of bolts, a whole lot of bolts that go all the way around. There's some in the middle. Your best bet is to go all the way around really slowly and look. Now I have a tip for timing covers. Anytime you're taking off a timing cover, and it's trying to come off and it just feels like it's stuck, you need to look very carefully because if it feels like it's stuck, it most likely still has a bolt in it. Now, if you see me using the pry bar here, I'm trying to find places to pry. I'm trying to break the timing cover free, and I feel like there's just still something connected because it is not separating. And lo and behold, right above the water pump, there's two bolts. You'll see those in a second. I discovered those. The other hard part is trying to find a place to pry on this without breaking it. So there's the two bolts right there, above the water pump. It kind of tricked me because of the whole water pump area, kind of messed me up. But now the best part is still to come. So now I've got those bolts out. So in my eyes, I've got all the bolts out. This timing cover should pop loose. So here I am with a pry bar trying to get it off. And what the heck? Another bolt. Wow, how did I miss that one? That's 3 bolts, and 2 of them were right next to each other. That's the funny part. So now the timing cover is going to come right off. There it is. You can see it wiggling right there. So the timing cover, a lot of times, the oil pump is in the timing cover on a lot of vehicles, and it has to line up with the crank. So in some vehicles, that is the reason when you're putting a timing cover on or taking it off, it feels a little stuck, is because the oil pump has to line up. Now you got to get the water crossover off. Now this is a whole lot more complicated than the old water crossover in the old Subarus. The old water crossover just went from head to head and heater hoses. This one has EGR going through it. So the EGR valve is actually on the coolant crossover. And then you have EGR pipes and gaskets. So if I'm reusing a timing chain, I always mark the sprockets and the chain to each other. In this one, I'm wiping off the front of the phasers so I can mark all the timing marks so I can get it lined up before I disassemble. And the last two, man, they gave me some trouble trying to find the timing marks. Once I got that done, I wiped the chain down and I made a mark on the chain and the sprocket on all 4 points, and I did it on the crank as well. I always do that because that way I know if the engine is in time right now, as long as I put this chain back where it was, it should be in time on most engines. So on the right cams there, you can see the 2 pink dots. They're right above each other. You have to roll the engine over until those line up. So the first thing we're going to do is the passenger side. We're going to take the tensioner off first, just a couple tens. Then you're going to take off the fixed guide off the top. And then you're going to take off the slipper off the bottom. And then we're going to slip the chain off. And then what I'm going to do, since that chain's out of the way, I'm going to get a really good mark on the driver's side chain to sprocket, because it's really hard to mark that one because it sits in front of it. So then you got to take off the tensioner for the driver's side. That one's a little trickier. It sits inside the timing cover, so you got to kind of pry it out with a screwdriver. Once you get that out, and there's also an O-ring behind that tensioner, so keep track of that. You're going to want to replace it. But then you're going to take off the lower guide, which is the fixed guide, and the upper guide. Get those out of the way, and then you're going to get your chain out of the way. Now watch what happens. Now, after you take off the passenger chain, before you do the driver's side chain, you're supposed to rotate the engine because the cams are not in a resting position. And as you can see right there, since I didn't move the cams, I left them in their original position. As soon as I started to release that chain, the cams jumped. So they didn't jump a whole lot. And it's fine to take them off. It didn't hurt anything, and it definitely didn't bend any valves. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and get the chain off because, well, we're taking the cams out anyways. So now it's time to start messing with the left-hand head. We're going to go ahead and take it off. So I rotated the engine stand where the head is sticking straight up. We're going to pull the valve cover off, and there's a coolant pipe that went across there, had some bolts that went through the coolant pipe. Got that all disconnected, and next up, we're going to do all the cam caps. So you're going to take all the cam caps off. There's one on the front that goes over both cams right there. And then there's 2 center ones and 2 rear ones. Keep them separate. Don't mix them up. So I always lay out the valve train the way it's going to come off. So I'll put the cams on a cart, and then I'll lay out all the components. So once you get that off, there's a couple bolts, and the cam carrier is going to come out. Then from there, you're going to have rocker arms, lifters, and you're going to have valve shims. That's just a little cap that goes over the tip of the valve. You want to lay all those out the way that you take them off. Do not mix them up. Those little caps on the valves are really important. That Milwaukee 1440, that's not even the newest Milwaukee. It's zapping those head bolts right out. Those little shims on top of the valves, that's how your valves are shimmed and adjusted. So if you get them mixed up, your engine may not run, or it will run really rough. That Milwaukee is a beast. So once you've got that all done, make sure that everything is disconnected from your cylinder head. That way you don't break anything, you don't have anything that you leave, or when you send it to the machine shop, you won't get it back if it's still attached to the head. You want to make sure it's all off. And the head should pop right off. Then you're going to have your head gasket. And then underneath your head gasket is, well, it's a plastic ring that goes around your coolant passage. That's what it looks like right there. So you're going to do the same thing to the other head and pull that head off. Now we're going to do the oil pan. I pulled off the lower oil pan already. It was easy. Just undo all the bolts around it. You can hit the oil pan around itself with a dead blow, and it will break free so you don't bend it. You don't bend the lip of the oil pan. Also, take off your oil pickup just so you don't break it. There's one O-ring underneath there, so keep track of that. And then undo all the bolts around the perimeter, and your upper oil pan comes off. Now, there are 3 O-rings in that upper oil pan. Actually, in the block where your upper oil pan seals to. So my cylinder heads are still at the shop right now, at the machine shop. So we're going to go ahead and get this upper oil pan on. So right now, first up, we're going to be cleaning all the grooves in where the O-rings go. So that's what I'm doing there. Using a little pocket screwdriver, taking some Brillo pad type stuff and cleaning it real good all the way around. That's what you need right there, the 3-bond to do this job. You're going to need that for the upper oil pan, the lower oil pan, and the head gaskets. So you're going to put it around the perimeter of your upper oil pan, and you're going to set it down, make sure it locks in place in the right spot. And before you do this, you want to make sure that you blow out all your holes for your upper oil pan bolts. You want to make sure that there's no oil or coolant or anything in those holes, because then you'll end up with a hydrolocked hole and you can crack your block. So here I put all the bolts in, just going to zap them around, and then I'm going to torque all the upper oil pan bolts. The upper oil pan bolts are 13.3 foot-pounds, and the lower oil pans is 57 inch-pounds. So those are the specs right there. And I also showed you a diagram of the order to torque the bolts in. So what I like to do when I'm torquing things like this is I go through, I torque the whole thing like I'm supposed to, and then I go back and I torque it one more time just to make sure that nothing loosened up. Now, to do this job, you're going to need one O-ring for your oil pickup, and that's right there. You definitely want to take that off, because cleaning your upper oil pan with that pickup on is really difficult. You're going to need the 3 O-rings in between the block and the upper oil pan. And then there's also 2 seals between the lower oil pan and the upper oil pan. So once you get that all done, make sure that your oil pickup is torqued. You're going to wipe around your upper oil pan to lower oil pan mating surface. And then there's a spot right there at the 11 o'clock position, and then one about the 3 o'clock position. You're going to wipe those out real good, because there's going to be a seal on the lower oil pan. Then you're just going to put your silicone around the perimeter, put all your bolts in, and get it torqued up. Just like that.
You also want to oil your head bolts on both sides of the washer and the threads on all of them before you put them in. All right, so we all make mistakes. I'm putting this Subaru engine back together, and somehow I got the heads mixed up, and I torqued the head on the wrong side. As you can see, this is the intake side, and this is the exhaust. I thought the machine shop put the cams in wrong, because they took all the valve train and put all new valves in. And I went to do the cams, and the cams said left hand, and I'm like, what in the world? So yeah, we all make mistakes. Yeah, this is a first for me. Let me know if you guys have done this before. All right, so after I torqued this head on the wrong side of the engine, took it all back apart, got the right head gasket, head bolts, torqued it back on, got all the cam carriers in, everything. And I noticed this. Yeah, I forgot to put that around the water jackets under the head gasket. So now this has got to come back apart again. Yeah, it's not my day. All right, head bolt torque. Here's your head. This is the torque spec right there. So the first step is going to be 21.4 foot-pounds. The second step is going to be 73.8 foot-pounds. The third step is you're going to loosen all of them 180 degrees. Step 4, tighten all of them to 31 foot-pounds. Step 5, all of them 80 degrees. Step 6, only bolts 1 and 2 to 75 degrees. Step 7, the outer 4 bolts, 3 through 6, 30 degrees.
Don't forget to put the plastic around the coolant jackets underneath the head gasket. Make sure that you put that on. And then you're going to cut the silicone off right there where the upper oil pan and the block meet. Next up is disassembling the head. In my case, I had the heads all taken apart, and we normally only send the cylinder head itself to the machine shop. So the machine shop got it, they checked it, and they recommended that the customer replace all the valves and a valve adjustment. And to do that, they needed all of the valve train. So I had to go and take all the valve train and put them back in the heads and build the heads back completely, send them to the machine shop, and then when I got them back, that's how I got mixed up with the heads, and that's also how I accidentally forgot the plastic around the combustion chamber, because I had all the parts together on a cart, and then I had to take all the parts off of the cart, and so then I had the heads not with the cart, and it wasn't until I went to put the valve cover on that I noticed the plastic that goes around the coolant jacket. So you notice there I put silicone on the edge of the block, and then you set the head gasket down, and then you put the silicone back on top of the head gasket. So it needs to go between the block and the head gasket, and the head gasket and the head. And what that does is make sure that you have a good seal where your seams are for your timing cover. So you want to make sure that you oil your head bolts, oil the threads and both sides of the washer and underneath the head of the bolt. And then you're just going to put the bolts in. You want to make sure that you have the head on the right side of the engine. And then go through your torque spec or through your torque sequence. So here we have this little plastic housing on the front of the top of the block on the passenger side in the front. And that is there's a seal in there, and it's not serviceable. The only way to replace that seal is from replacing that little plastic housing with the two nipples. Now this PCV hose right here, you notice that I'm spinning the hose. That's because I did not take it off of the fitting that goes in the block. I unscrewed the fitting when I took it out of the car, and to put it back, I left the hose connected because that hose likes to break under there, and I don't want it to break and have to replace it. So here I'm putting on the little manifold runners on each side and the coolant crossover and getting all that hooked up. They all kind of go together. And don't forget the spark plug tube seals. They do not come with valve cover gaskets. They're separate, but don't forget them.
All right, so I'm building this Subaru engine here, and there's nothing worse than an engine stand that you're having to roll the engine by lifting it up. Plus, our engine stand doesn't even have a locking mechanism, so I've got my lady's foot in here. I really wish I had one of those ones with a crank that you could like turn with a crank and roll the engine over. That would be so nice and so convenient. You know what else I need? I need one of the pans that has a hump in the middle to go under an engine stand so you don't make a fat mess. So we're getting ready to time this engine, and what you want to do before you put the chains in and everything, because the chains get in the way, you want to go ahead and clean all your joints of the silicone. So I've cut it all over on this side. I just need to take a Brillo pad and clean it. As you can see over here, I haven't cleaned this side yet. So you want to make sure that you get all that clean, get all that out of there. Right here where your oil pan is, everything, because it's much harder once you have the chain in. So you want the dowel angled at right here. Not the keyway, angled with the dowel. All right. Mark your crankshaft sprocket right there where the dowel is. So we're going to be doing the left-hand side first, which is the driver's side. Then you're going to turn this cam where this mark is approximately here, and this mark is approximately there. So when you put your chain in, your mark should line up with your crank here. Make sure you're under your dowels like this, and on top of your dowels. Come over here. And this mark, this link should be lined up with that mark right there. And then this link right there should be lined up with that mark. Then we're going to put the bottom tensioner on, the bottom guide on first. So this guide here, there's a pin here, a dowel here, and then one bolt. That's an Allen. So you got to get the chain lifted up above. Now, if you can't put this guide in, then your cams and your crank are not in the right spot. This should barely slip under. And make sure your chain is in the groove of the tensioner. And then your tensioner, it should wobble a little bit. Shouldn't be tight.
So you want to make sure that all of the slack is out of the chain on the bottom and on the sides. So we're going to put the top chain guide in, which is called the slipper. And it slips in, and it usually only attaches in one spot because the tensioner is on the other end, and it moves constantly. So what I'm doing here now is there's a little bit of slack in the chain. So I'm going to take the cam, and I'm going to rotate the slack out of the bottom of the chain. So that way I have the maximum amount of slack in the top. Then I'm going to put the O-ring in there in the block. I'm going to put my tensioner in, tighten my tensioner down. And before you pull the pin on the tensioner, you want to double check your marks. You want to check the crank and both cams. And sure enough, the bottom cam I'm off on. So now I got to take the tensioner back off, and I got to take that upper slipper off so I can rotate the chain around and adjust that sprocket and get the chain on. Not a big deal. I mean, even if I had pulled the pin on the tensioner, I would have just had to reset it. Not a super big deal, but again, I had to take it back apart. So we're going to go back together with this thing, and then it should be good. So to do the timing on the driver's side, the cams aren't technically in time with each other. They're off time, but that way the cams can sit. Because if you had them in time, they would rotate. Remember when I took it apart and they popped? Well, so now we're going to put them actually in time. So now what we're going to do is we rotate the engine around until the dots are right on top of each other on all four cams, both sides. Then we're going to take the chain and we're going to drape it around and we're going to get it set up. Now we're going to be putting in the upper guide first because that is the fixed guide. So we're going to put that one in, and then we're going to put the slipper in.
So you pull this forward, and it pulls this lock this way, and it removes the bite down onto the tensioner plunger. And so when you push this lever forward, it's rocking this mechanism like this. And you push it all the way in, and then you have to pull this mechanism back and put a pin through there.
So before we pull the pin, we want to go ahead and confirm that all of our timing marks are lined up again, just like the other side. Now watch what happens when I pull the pin. Watch the tensioner. It shot out the bottom. I put the tensioner in upside down. Oh my God, I don't know if I can mess up any more on this engine. So now I got to go pull the tensioner back off and reset it and then put it back in so we can pull the pin and get this engine timed and be done with this thing already. All right, so I put the tensioner in. I'm going to run the bolts in and zap them in with my ratchet, and I go back by hand just to make sure that they're tight. So here I'm just going back, confirming that my links all line up with my marks on my engine. Now, once I turn this engine over, the links will not line up with the marks on the engine anymore, and then we will have to solely rely on the engine timing marks. So we're going to pull the pin, and now it's time to turn the engine over. So you want to turn the engine over 2 full revolutions. So that means that you want the crank to turn 4 times, because when the crank turns 1 time, the cams only turn half. So for the cams to turn 1 full turn, the crank has to spin twice. So we want the crank to spin 4 times because we want the engine to turn over 2 full revolutions. And then we're going to rotate it until those 2 dots line up and those 2 dots line up.
When you're all done, you roll it over to make sure that everything feels normal. These two should be straight up and down from each other. These two should be straight up and down from each other. And you see that white right there? That should be 10 degrees to that way. Just a hair. Shouldn't be straight up and down. It should be offset just a little bit. 10 degrees. Now, we got to get all the timing cover, make sure everything's all cleaned up. Get ready to put the cover on.
Also, make sure you put all your O-rings on behind the timing cover. So you're going to put your silicone around the timing cover, and then you're going to go on all the joints on the block and the heads, the cam carrier, and you're going to put a little bit of silicone on every single joint behind the timing cover, and also have a continuous bead of silicone around the timing cover. You put it on the joints to make sure that it pushes in, so there's no chance of a leak where there's a T-seam. Now you'll notice that I'm putting pink dots. So what I do is when I torque things like timing covers and oil pans and things like that, I put a dot on the bolts to make sure that I've torqued them. So when I go back with a mirror and look, I see a dot, I know I torqued it. So next up, to put the wiring harness on. So lay the wiring harness on, and my best advice with wiring harnesses is start on one side and work your way around to the other. If you just start randomly connecting things, you're going to miss stuff. You're going to leave something disconnected. And then when you go to start it, you're going to have a check engine light. So I put the compressor on already, and then I just put the balancer on. Now it's time for the oil dipstick and the harness on the other side of the engine. And then I'm going to be putting the fan pulley on, not the fan pulley, but the upper pulley where the power steering pump used to go. There's just a pulley there now. Used to be a power steering pump back in the day. Now it has electric steering. And then we're going to put the water pump in. So don't forget your water pump pulley. Make sure your bolts are tight. And on to that pulley there I was talking about earlier. That's also the tensioner and the idler. And now we're going to do the valve cover. Now the valve cover is kind of weird the way they want you to put the silicone. They want you to run the silicone up and over the humps. Like that. That's how they want the silicone on the valve covers. Kind of weird. Usually we only put it on the seams. So, going to go ahead and run this silicone. Well, it's not really, I keep saying silicone. It's really like the 3-bond. But we're going to go ahead and run that up and over the humps and get these valve covers on. I initially was only putting it in the seams. And then I actually went up just to look at what the spec was, and I saw that they want it up and over the humps. So I pulled it back off real quick because I actually had put it on, stuck it on, then I pulled it off real quick and put the silicone on there the way that they want it on. So that way we don't have any issues because I don't want any leaks. I definitely don't want to do this job again, even if it was my own car.
So here are the bolts for the timing cover. And pay attention to the T1s. And then all the rest are T2s around the perimeter. I'm going to show you the torque spec. So go ahead and pause it right there. So here is the torque spec for those 2 bolts. This is a picture of the silicone that you need to put on there. Make sure that you put it on those sections right there in the center where it goes. Right there, right there, right there. Now you're going to have some O-rings. You're going to have this O-ring, and that O-ring, and those are all the same. Before you put your chain tensioner on, there's one there. That one's different. I'm waiting for that one and for this one. You're going to put a little bit of oil on all these O-rings before you put your cover on. well, that one's a chain tensioner, but all these. And then what I like to do is I put silicone on the cover, and then right here at all the joints, I will run a silicone on all the joints to make sure that it gets pushed into those joints, that there's no chance of a leak. And I have all these places. Make sure it's all really clean right there, along there. So here it is converted. So a T1 is 88 inch-pounds. The T2 is 18.4 foot-pounds. Water pump is 56.4, and the thermostat is 56.4 inch-pounds.
Now that you've seen this video, you should feel pretty confident in doing this Subaru head gasket job. The timing is pretty amazing because there's no special tools involved. And the timing is really, really simple. So, thanks for watching the video. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell to get notified of all my future content, which you definitely don't want to miss. I'll see you guys next time.